Masque of the Red Death.
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence his hale and light-hearted friends, and with this retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and wielded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There was beauty, there was wine. All peace and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion that the Prince Prospero entertained his friends at the masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. An imperial suite. A tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries, but in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The paints here were scarlet, a deep blood color. There were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its presence at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony, and when the hour was to be stricken, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. But, in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste. He had approached the figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.